Thanks for being here this afternoon. Nice to have you all with us for this really exciting conversation. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Parker Blackman. I'm Executive Director of the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. The LA Partnership is a public-private partnership with over 25 private foundations and public agencies serving the children and families of LA County. And the mission of the partnership is simply to leverage philanthropy for systemic changes that benefit the most vulnerable children, birth to 5, and their families in LA County. And I can't think of a more exciting topic to talk about today than guaranteed income as a lever for alleviating poverty for the most vulnerable children and families in LA County. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to say just very quick few words. I want to thank Southern California Grantmakers. They continue to be just excellent partners in putting together these events. So I want to thank Bethany and all of our colleagues at Southern California Grantmakers for being such wonderful partners on these events. I want to thank our speakers and our moderator for joining us today. You all should have received the bios for our speakers, so we're not going to spend a lot of time detailing their backgrounds. I will just say we have a late-breaking guest who'll join us later in the conversation, and that's Supervisor Holly Mitchell. As many of you know, Supervisor Mitchell authored and helped to pass another pilot on guaranteed income for the County of Los Angeles. So very exciting. We've got a really great conversation today. The way this is going to work, as many of you know, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Alex Johnson, Program Director at the California Wellness Foundation here momentarily. Alex is going to say a few words and then talk with some of our speakers and do our best to make sure that we have enough time for them to share the most important points they want to share today and leave time for conversation so that this can be a robust dialogue, with the main thing being, what are the opportunities for action? Where can philanthropy be a good partner with cities, with counties, with others who are putting together these really important pilot projects? So with that in mind, I am going to, one last thing. If you have questions, you have comments, use the Q&A box. Put them in there, and then we'll make sure that Alex gets to as many of the questions as we can. So use the Q&A box, and we will go from there. Thanks, everyone. Alex, I really appreciate you and your leadership at California Wellness taking the time to help us organize and think through and moderate this conversation. It's over to you. Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you, Parker, for the kind introduction. Thank you for the words. And thank you to everyone who's joining us for what is a critical conversation. We would be remiss if we did not collectively pause and take a moment to reflect and to remember the life of George Floyd. 1 year ago today, a man was murdered in an act that was not only dehumanizing, but was willful, was depraved, and was indifferent. For no other reason except for the color of his skin. And the memory of that crime, as despairing and tragic as it is, should continue to agitate our state of comfort, keep our consciousness unsettled, and summon not silence, but a strengthening and a recommitment to the ongoing fight for racial equity and racial justice. Now is not the time to drink the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, Dr. King said. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all children. Today's discussion and the important work of the esteemed panelists who will join us momentarily should give us hope. It should give us a sense of forward progress. And it should not be lost on any of us that racial justice is deeply intertwined with economic justice. In an interview earlier this year, one of our panelists, former Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs, reminded us that Dr. King began raising the notion of a guaranteed basic income in 1967. Now, nearly 54 years later, phrases like guaranteed income and universal basic income are becoming commonplace. Cities like Los Angeles and Stockton and Compton and San Francisco and Oakland and Long Beach are in various stages of programs and pilots. Los Angeles County recently approved a pilot for guaranteed income, and Governor Newsom's revised budget included millions for local pilot programs. And that's just some of what is taking place in California as cities across the nation are launching guaranteed income programs. So what's the difference between guaranteed income and universal basic income? All too often the terms are conflated, but we will hear more from our speakers. And so I want to provide you just some important distinctions to ground us in our discussion today. Universal basic income is essentially a scenario where the government provides every citizen with a lump sum of income every year, no strings attached. While guaranteed income provides cash payments to specific targeted communities of people with the goal of addressing income inequality and serving as a built-in income floor for those without one. So let's get into the discussion. We are excited to have really just some tremendous speakers today. As Parker said, their bios were provided in advance. You can read them at your leisure. But why don't we welcome at this time Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, Compton Mayor Asia Brown, Dr. Zea Malawa, and Michael Tubbs. And I want to begin the conversation with Mayor Eric Garcetti, a committed public servant, the 42nd Mayor of Los Angeles, a role that he has held for almost 8 years. And Mayor Garcetti recently announced a bold plan for recovery through the equity and justice budget. And included in that city budget was $24 million for the basic income guaranteed program. In addition, another $6 million was previously allocated for a pilot program in the 9th Council District led by Curran Price. So Mayor Garcetti, I know we only have you for a short while, so I want to first of all welcome you and thank you for joining us. But also offer you the opportunity to provide some brief remarks, and then we'll jump into a few questions. Mayor Garcetti.
Well, thank you, Alex, for who you are and what you bring to this, and what an honor it is to be here with my fellow mayor and with you, the entire group. Parker, your incredible force of nature, personality, and the way that you've focused on what's important for so long. It's a real honor to be here. And thank you, Alex, for grounding us on this day, because a year ago, I think all of us were broken. Pandemic had started to break us, and what happened to George Floyd literally broke us. It broke not only our hearts, but our spirits and our souls. But it also the next day spurred us into recognizing that we couldn't try to rebuild out of this pandemic by returning to what was, that we had to do something more radical. Radical in the sense of trying to, as the poet Robert Browning once said, let our reach exceed our grasp, to stretch out to something we thought maybe we couldn't hold when it comes to racial justice and economic opportunity, when it comes to community health, and to try to build a city and cities, a state, a country, and ultimately a world that reflects what we feel in our hearts and the pain that we felt that day too. It's been an extraordinary year of so much trauma and loss, but it's also a moment in which hope no longer hangs on the horizon. It actually can be held in our hands for the first time in so long. We're literally shaking hands and hugging for the first time. I went out to a restaurant yesterday with my oldest friend from high school for the first time in a long time. We're starting to feel what it means to be human again. But let's be absolutely clear about what the stakes are as we move forward, that we have to face the ugly truths of the past year. We cannot run away from them. We need to turn back and to see them in order to inform the path forward. The deeply rooted inequities in communities of color for decades and centuries, the generational poverty that we have allowed to exist for too long. So let me cut to the chase, and I'm going to quote a line that I wrote for my State of the City address. It is, to me, America's greatest addiction is our addiction to poverty. And it's time to break America's addiction to poverty. It's an addiction that costs us tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars a year of lost productivity, of lost lives, of lost hope and opportunity, of educational outcomes that are not what they should be, of criminal justice costs that are beyond any other industrialized country. We pay for poverty every single day. It is very expensive to be cheap. It is very expensive to be poor. And so we have a moment to take a powerful and a proven tool to be in some ways the tip of that spear, an intervention, that guaranteed basic income, to show that we can end poverty, not in people's lifetimes, but in their near term and their medium term, And we've seen the first chapter written by Michael Tubbs and in Stockton. The book is there. And I'm so proud to be with Asia Brown and Robert Garcia and Holly Mitchell and others who are part of this movement. We're the co-authors of a second chapter together with everybody on this call. We've seen GBI help break people out of poverty. It's not an abstraction anymore. It's rooted in data. When Mayor Tubbs launched the first extensive GBI pilot in a specific city, the 2-year study showed us that people felt less exhausted, less anxious. Think about the mental health that we've all gone through this year. That's something that if you're poor, you feel every day of every year. And so the work that we can do to reassure people, the better education outcomes, the better full-time employment, the homework help you give to a child, the appointment for healthcare you can take so that you don't wait for things to get bad. We actually know this works. And we have evidence of what happens when the federal government steps up, again, not in some abstraction or in some sort of university classroom. We've actually been doing this. We saw the beginning of this pandemic, poverty reduced 20% in this country in the worst economic moment of our lives. We see the projections of childhood poverty being cut in half by taking a tax credit and actually doubling it and paying it out month by month. Not much money that could actually cut in half childhood poverty. What have we been waiting for so long? That's the only question we should be asking ourselves. So we have this potent tool. We have a growing movement. And I'm proud to be a founding member of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, alongside Mayor Tubbs and Mayor Brown, a group that we initially started with 11 mayors, now 43, on our way to push to 100 mayors and cities just this year alone. So if your mayor isn't yet part of this, if your city's not part of this, call her, call him and say, get with it. We did the same thing when we withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. When President Trump did that, we started just saying, we'll sign on, until we had 450 cities that did the same thing. The power of America isn't in Washington, D.C., it's in the grassroots of our local communities. The $24 million you described is now up, I'm proud to say, to $40 million. The extra money that we had, the council was able to add citywide, we now will have the largest, both in terms of absolute dollars and the number of people served. At least 2,000, it could be as many as 4,000 households or 3,600 that will receive $1,000 a month for a year, and give us a data set that we can look at, and not by itself, but with other actions that we can take, whether it's layering on free community college, which we now have in the state, layering on the possibility of free transit, which we're looking at LA Metro, layering on the opportunities to provide health and educational opportunities early on. We're going to draw from all 15 council districts of LA City this life-changing and life-saving work. We know that poverty affects 2 out of every 10 Angelenos, most of whom are of color. And GBI is not just a social safety net, it's an instrument of racial equity. On this day, if we don't see that, it's not exclusively about racial equity, but it is deeply about racial equity. And let's make this day mean something by seeing what we can do to push that forward. No questions asked, no strings attached. During the pandemic, when we raised about $70 million privately while we're waiting for Washington, we distributed that. And through the technology on the cards, the Angeleno cards, but while anonymizing the data, we could see where people were spending that money. And it wasn't on a bigger TV. It was on a better job. It was on healthcare. It was on food. It was on rent. It was on utilities. It was on those basics. And it's not replacing work. Those myths that people say folks won't work. If you get $1,000 a month, that's not enough to replace a job. But what it is it's enough to get you a better job. It's enough to get you home without an extra shift, so your child knows what it's like to be assisted with her math homework. And some will say it's un-American to pay people who aren't doing anything for the cash. But there's another way of looking at this. This is deeply American. It's libertarian in essence, because it trusts people to make their own decisions. We're trusting people to make good decisions, and the evidence shows that they do. It's the same here in Los Angeles. We know 40% of the money that we had during the pandemic that we gave people went to food, 15% at retail and discount stores, and 11% on utilities and telephone bills. So we're calling it Big Leap in the city of Los Angeles. And it is that. It's a small but steady investment, and it won't exist in a vacuum. We're going to bring it together with the idea that ending poverty takes not just one insertion, but many together. But to me, this is the engine of our anti-poverty policy. And that momentum, Governor Newsom adding $35 million, which we intend to get our match from. And thank you, Mayor Tubbs. I bet you had something to do with that as the governor's advisor. The incredible program that Mayor Brown kicked off that inspired me here in Los Angeles, in Long Beach, in West Hollywood, in San Diego. This is a movement, and now is the moment. So I look forward to our discussion, and let's end that addiction to poverty in Los Angeles and California and America, and to say to these folks, 2 or 3 years later, we actually took you out of poverty instead of sustained you in it, which has been our approach for far too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Garcetti. You really answered the question of why and why you launched this guaranteed income pilot. I'm excited to hear that the amount has increased to 40 million. And there's so much that can be said about the importance of this. You've said previously, small investments have big payoffs. That's sort of seared in my head. Small investments have big payoffs. And so what do you hope to achieve? What do you hope this pilot will accomplish in the city of Los Angeles?
I hope we can get away from caricature and get to actual reality, because so many of the discussions around this, people, like so much of politics today, pick a side. Like, well, am I philosophically supposed to be against this, rather than, hey, let's just see what this does. Like, let's be evidence-based instead of ideological based. And that's what I hope it'll bear out. Second, I hope it'll show the nuance of how it works in different places. It's not going to be the same everywhere. We have to show what this means. We're folks who have the compounding effects of racism and some who don't, but are poor. We have to look at what it means to have education and health opportunities, child savings accounts, which Mayor Tubbs was with me and this governor started when he was mayor in San Francisco. Like, when we put a suite of things together, and we can't do that with everybody, so we'll have evidence of what the difference that makes on top of this to accelerate that even more. Our goal isn't to get a guaranteed basic income for everybody. Our goal is to end poverty for everybody. So I hope to get out of this how effective this is in accelerating that, because basic incomes exist. Social Security is a basic income that's guaranteed. We have SSI, which is a basic income guaranteed. What we do is we lose all the rest of the poor who don't fit into a category, not old enough, not disabled enough, not whatever enough. You're married and not single enough, whatever it is. This is a chance to say anybody who's poor is an American, and to get that data in there to see what works. And then to take that, because long-term, and everybody always asks this question, this would be too expensive for cities to do on their own. I think Mayor Brown and I would both acknowledge that. We took everybody who's poor in our cities and gave them all a basic income. We wouldn't do anything else with the rest of the money you expect us to spend on parks and libraries and everything else. This is to inspire states potentially, and certainly the federal government, to take this model to say, I don't have to guess about this. If this happens in 100 cities successfully across geography, across ethnicity, across age, then our feds better step up and say, we'll take it from here.
And so it leads me to my next question. I appreciate the response, and also appreciate really the response of getting away from the caricature that comes from poverty, and the strong focus and vision to end poverty. It sounds like you want and you envision moving this from a pilot project to a fully funded program at the city level. Is that what I'm hearing you saying, Mayor Garcetti?
At the federal level, because if you do the math, I mean, if we took 600,000 households or 600,000 people rather, and just did the math on this, it would be about a $2 billion a year city hit, maybe as much as 4 billion. And we only have about 7 billion in our general fund that's unrestricted. So there's no way we could do that without massive cuts to the rest of the infrastructure. This is something that has to be done at a state or national level. We're giving the inspiration for this, just as we did community college free for a couple of years, and then the state picked it up and made it free community college for the entire state. Just as we're trying to do with homelessness and the right to housing, which I hope, and we've got with President Biden, somebody who's pledged to make Section 8 housing vouchers an entitlement instead of a lottery. We are the kind of laboratories that prove the concept. And then we take this coalition and this movement at the federal level, or maybe state, and say, here's a way we can fund this long term. And I think one of the things we'll see over time, and I hope that we get some pilots, but I don't want to wait this long, that show a 6 or 7 or 8 year trend that people exit out of poverty 2, 3, 4 years into a basic income. That's the goal. You might not get those exits the first year. You'll show the improvements, but not necessarily the exits of poverty. But once people are graduating from high school and going to college, getting decent jobs, parents have a better job, et cetera, you're going to see poverty eroding. And then we have to focus on the wealth building around that. So it's not something that cities could sustain universally. We should be really clear about that. But it is something that cities can inspire this nation to do universally.
Thank you. I want to go back to something you referenced earlier, and really delves into the next question. you lifted up the work that the Mayor's Fund did and has been doing, not just during the pandemic, but across your tenure. You raised $70 million, the Angelino card that was distributed across the city to well over 100,000 Angelinos in need. How can philanthropy partner with the city on this work? What role do you envision philanthropy having in this work to advance it, to catalyze it, to help move it forward?
So I would say 3 ways. One is by helping places that maybe can't afford it on their own. So you know, LA could figure out a way to do it. We're a big city. We're not a rich city, by the way. Per capita, we're poorer than a lot of small cities. But there are also small cities that I think philanthropy, as Mayor Brown has done so well, and others, really can be the difference between a pilot happening or not. Second is in the network. Invest in Mayors for Guaranteed Income. It's the network that's out there, or any other networks that emerge. It doesn't have to just be us, but invest in it in a way that we can bring more organizers, researchers, and build the movement. And third, support those that are doing the data around this, whether it's, you know, the University of Pennsylvania, local partners, or other folks, as well as some of the organizations that we all rely on for the implementation of this. Because it is a difficult thing to pick who does this and to do that quickly. You saw this happen during this year when people wanted to help immigrants, for instance. Every nonprofit's phone line system crashed that day that the state grants went out. Here in the city, we had like 2 hours of a crash when we did the Angelino card, but then we called, for all of us who've run for political campaigns before, we just called political phone bankers, and we got like, you know, 100 people right away, and we got it going. So there's infrastructure needs that are out there that philanthropy can make a big difference on, to make sure we don't trip up on things like the implementation of it. So it's really data, the network, and helping, I think, smaller cities get some of the direct pilots going.
Thank you, Mayor. Just simply want to express on behalf of all of us our appreciation for your leadership and all that you're doing to ensure and improve the quality of life for Angelinos. I want to thank you so much. I wish we had more time today, but we just appreciate all that you are doing, that you have done.
You know where to find me now. Now you'll get upgraded with Mayor Brown. So I just laid the table for her. Thank you, Alex.
So much.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Mayor.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. I want to thank again Mayor Garcetti, and turn to another mayor, former mayor, Michael Tubbs. Michael, it's great to see you. And I was thinking back about almost a decade ago, I think, if memory serves me accurately, when we first met, and I think it was at Haley Farm. And then subsequently another occasion doing some trainings with your mentor, my former boss, Mary Wright Edelman, and Gene Sharp around nonviolent movement building. And I recall listening to you, and you had this just very distinct presence, but you also had a vision for the world, a vision for your hometown of Stockton, a vision for children and families. And you had and have had this can-do attitude, this will-do, this must-do attitude. And so first, just want to say how immensely proud of you and just the tremendous respect I have for you as a brother and a friend. But having listened to Mayor Garcetti and witnessing these guaranteed income projects take root across the nation, did you think that the seeds you planted in Stockton would launch what could only be called a movement across the nation?
Well, first, thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm a little bit upset Mayor Garcetti went first, because Mayor Brown, he took all the good lines. You know, we have our little zingers we have. He took all of them, Dr. King, research, but I'm so thankful for Mayor Garcetti and his leadership. And also want to say, I think we talk about Dr. King, but over the past year, I've been learning more about the role of Black women and sort of this conversation around guaranteed income. So love having Dr. Malawa and Mayor Brown on here, because the National Welfare Organization, a group of Black women at the same time as Dr. King's, were also pushing for this idea. And it's great to have them on, and I appreciate their leadership. So to answer your question, and for your leadership and for your vision and putting this together into the partnership. Well, that was, for me, that was always the point, because when we first were talking about it, and I was like, okay, Stockton's about 315,000 people. Okay, we're going to help 125 people. And I was excited for those 125 people. But I knew I was going to have 314,000, whatever. Other people really upset with me because they were like, we need a guaranteed income too. But the idea was, being first is sometimes is always very difficult, but once you create a permission structure, then you have other people go. And I think I'm so thankful, because I had no idea at the scale at which people would take it, right? I thought everyone would be like, okay, 100 people. And then Mayor Brown came out with 800 people, like, bam. And I was like, okay. Then Mayor Garcetti said, we're gonna take money from some money from policing and some money from other things in the city budget and do 24 million, bam. Like, I've been really shocked at the ways in which other mayors in other cities have took the idea and have really owned it for themselves and speak about their own experiences, whether it's growing up, whether it's their constituents. And that's been inspiring to see. And I think for a community like Stockton, which usually we're always looked at for what's broken or what's wrong, I would always tell people that part of the reason why we're doing this is because we want our kids to look at Stockton, or our kids' kids to look at Stockton and say, that's that city that tried this thing that's now part of our social safety net. So I've been frankly exhausted. I'm almost tired of there's so much energy and so much happening that I'm tired a little bit, but in a good way, because it feels like we're very close. And I would say, to answer your question, I did not think we would see action from the federal government as quickly as we have now, with literally a guaranteed income for parents. Literally, I did not see that coming so quickly. So I'm very thankful. And I think it goes to the fact that one person is not enough. That it was just about Michael Tubbs and Stockton, people don't care. But when you have Michael Tubbs, Eric Garcetti, Asia Brown, Dr. Malawa, Mayor Bottoms, we have people from across the country, then the world starts to notice and say, okay, there's really something here, and how do we do it?
Thank you for that. I want to, and again, thank you for the leadership of everyone on this panel. I want to ask you, go a little deeper into the Stockton work, and what did you learn from the pilot project in Stockton that you think is the most valuable?
Yeah.
The most valuable lesson to bring forward to all of these pilots that are happening across California and across the nation?
Well, I learned so much actually before the pilot, when we were doing our design phase. And I learned that even those of us who come from a background of economic insecurity, and those of us who champion and fight for the rights and dignity of all people, because we live in a society that sends tropes and notions and caricatures of why people struggle, why people not, you can internalize some of those things. And I say that because I remember sitting in the living room and being surprised at some of the things people said they would spend money on, and surprised because they're very, very smart. Not surprised that the people were smart, but surprised that these ideas were smart. And I would look at my staff and say, there's no way we could have thought of that. There's no way we could design a program for that. One lady, it's basic things, Alex. One lady told me how the basic income would help her more in the summer. And I'm like, why? Why summer? I said, because you're AC? And she said, no, because my kids come home from college. And she said, I don't want them to know how much stress it causes me for them to come home, because my food goes up, my bills go up, my transportation go up, but I don't want them to think they can't come home. And she said, that was give me a peace of mind in the summer. And I was like, oh, so really this radical notion of trust, this radical notion of humility too, and that I don't care where you went to school, how much experience you have, what you study, no one is smart enough to think for everyone. A, and B, if you trust people to elect you, to be smart enough to elect you, if you trust people to be smart enough to take your advice or be part of your program, you should trust them to know how they're going to spend money for themselves and their family. And it seems so simple to me now, but 3-4 years ago, it was scary, because when we were piloting, it was like, well, what happens if someone's everyone thinks worst case scenario. So what happens if someone takes the money and buy a gun and does something? Is that going to affect, are you going to be liable? And you start to think about, oh shoot, all it takes is one. And now I just realized you can actually trust people, right? And you could trust people just like you trust yourself, because people are people, and people aren't in better financial circumstances necessarily because they're smarter. And I think it just took some time to really understand that, but now I'm locked in.
What a powerful story to convey about the mother and not wanting to disappoint her kids coming home. Such a powerful story, and I know there are countless stories like that across the nation. And so, can you give us the sense of Mayors for Guaranteed Income? Why did you start it?
Yeah.
And what are you trying to accomplish through it?
Well, part of it is just from being a mayor, I just know how mayors move. And I know if like you get a mayor's attention on something, mayors are like pit bulls. They are tenacious. They have locked jaws. They're not gonna let go. And I was blessed at the time I was mayor to be mayor at the same time with leaders I actually literally look up to and respect, like people I have deep love for as people. And I always wanted to like figure out, okay, what could we do together? And then when and today's the app day for this, when George Floyd was assassinated, there was so much conversation between mayors about how do we respond. And I remember going back and reading Where Do We Go From Here? And just thinking, like, I was like, when was this written? And it was like 1967. And I talked to one of my historian friends, and they're like, did you know in 1967, there were over 100 protests in this country around racial injustice? And Dr. King looked out on that and talked about a guaranteed income. And then I started thinking and reading and listening to the protests. And I'm like, well, the protests are about police violence for sure, but it's really about structural violence. It's about sort of the violence of lack of opportunity. And I figure like this is a moment where we're all willing to stretch. And also during the COVID time, Mayor Garcetti has the Angelino car, Mayor Brown was giving money to people. Like people were already doing cash transfers in different cities. It just felt like a right moment, and the Stockton pilot was coming to a close. And it just felt like this is the time to, and they were sending stimulus checks. So I was like, this is the time actually to reframe the conversation. So it's not about like robots in the future, but it's really about the present today, that's really talking about kind of civil rights, talking about economic dignity, and kind of in the spirit of the National Welfare Organization, the Black Panthers, and Dr. King. And I just thought that, like, literally, you guys should go to the U.S. Conference of Mayors conference, and you'll see like what I'm talking about, because once 10 mayors get on the microphone, everyone runs, is listening and taking notes. That mayors just have such a moral authority. And I thought if mayors make the case, particularly during their presidential year, then Congress would have to respond.
I know we want to hear about what you're up to with Governor Newsom, but I want to move us along. And in the interest of time, I want to ask you a question that I know our audience wants to hear more of. And it's this: how do we shift from pilots to policy with permanent, sustainable funding streams to really support this important work around guaranteed income? What do we need to do?
Yeah, and that's also part of the reason why Mayors for Guaranteed Income was founded, because mayors are also effective spokespeople and political animals, and they know how to move things in the policy world. So the idea is to sort of, and it's going to answer your last question in this one. The idea was to give no excuse to the federal government to act by having all these pilots in different cities where mayors are saying, look, you don't want to do it, I'll take the risk. I'll take the political risk, I'll get you the data, and I'll get my constituents and my residents, your voters, excited about this idea and really help push it mainstream. So it's not one face or one person, but it's a constellation of people who are all guaranteed income people. So that's part of it. And part of it is being very intentional about sort of, this is a policy pilot to get to policy. And really what I've been doing is talking to policymakers around sort of, well, what data do you need to see? And from how many people for you to make this a policy? Do you need 3,000 people, 10,000 people, 50? Like, I think it's setting some of the objective criteria, and philanthropy could be helpful with that. Like, hey, we want to see this as a policy if it accomplishes these 2 or 3 things, and just having people pledge support or say, yes, they would. And then once it happens, being able to kind of put pressure. And I think part of it's also a power building strategy. And that's why I like the fact that Dr. Malawa is on here, because we have mayoral-led stuff, which is very important, but also the community-led stuff is also equally as important. That provides even more voices and more energy towards pushing and saying, we want policy. And I think it has to be with every pilot, it has to be, I'm doing this pilot because there's not yet a policy. I'm doing this pilot because there's a policy failure and we want this to be rectified. And I think Dr. Zawala would probably talk about sort of the mom in this bill. And I think the $35 million we have in the budget from the state, the Golden State stimulus check number 2, which goes to everyone making 30 to 75K. It's a one-time payment, but we're getting there to the point where folks are excited about reoccurring payments. But the pilots are important because it creates permission structure and makes it cool, kind of gamify it. Now everyone's like, it's like, gotta catch them all. Everyone's trying to like, I want to do more. I want to do this people. I want to do this group. And it's making it exciting, which I think makes it more likely to become a policy some point in the near future.
Michael, Mayor Tubbs, want to thank you. I know we have you around and we'll have questions from the audience. Want to remind the audience that to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will make sure that we can lift up as many as we can. But Michael, again, want to thank you. I want to turn to Dr. Zea Malawa, and Dr. Malawa, it's just so wonderful to have you as a part of this conversation today. You have done just a lot of work to improve maternal health, to address racial inequities, and the Abundant Birth Project focuses on guaranteed income in the early childhood space for Black and Pacific Islander expecting and new mothers. And I read an article in Time magazine where you referenced the universal basic income experience in Canada that provided cash stipends to all low-income pregnant women, and how that led you to conceive the work that you're now doing and leading in San Francisco. So, Dr. Malawa, would you tell us about the Abundant Birth Project and why you chose to focus specifically on the particular population that you are focused on for this pilot?
It's very much my pleasure. And also, thank you so much for having me. I am breathing this rarefied air with all of these mayors, and Michael Tubbs helped me understand exactly how special this air is, all these special skills I didn't realize mayors had. So I feel really excited to be in this excellent company. So the Abundant Birth Project is a cash supplement project for Black and Pacific Islander pregnant people that will provide $1,000 a month, starting as early as we can get to you in pregnancy, and continuing through 6 months postpartum. And we are choosing this population and these people specifically, I think, for a few reasons. First, I'm a pediatrician, and I've been practicing for more than a decade in predominantly communities of color, and it has not been lost on me that Black families in particular are at particularly high risk for preterm birth. And a lot of times when we think about premature babies, we think about NICU stays, which are terrible and expensive and emotionally exhausting. But there's also long-term outcomes, because in addition to being a pediatrician, I'm also on First 5 San Francisco. And in First 5 San Francisco, we focus like lasers on kindergarten readiness disparities. And what I can say after 5 years of being on our commission is that year after year, we see the same groups that are showing up least ready for kindergarten, Black and Pacific Islander folks. The premature birth rates and these kindergarten readiness rates are not unrelated. These things are completely related, and all of these things are rooted in a long history of racism experienced by, in particular, these two communities. We don't know exactly what causes preterm birth still to this day. We can't tell you what the exact hormonal cascade is that causes some people to go into labor early and other people's not. But what we can say pretty confidently now is that there is a very strong association between racism and adverse birth outcomes like preterm birth, like low birth weight, like infant mortality, and honestly, maternal mortality. And so if we want to see changes in the rates of healthy births, in the rates of kindergarten readiness, we have to do something new. We cannot continue to do the same things because clearly they've proven to not be effective. And so the Abundant Birth Project is the culmination of me experiencing these disparities, not only as a pediatrician and a First Five commissioner, but as a mother of Black children, and living this data day in and day out through my own family and my community connections. And so this is really an attempt to try something extremely different so that we can have some extremely different results, because frankly, the Black community and the Pacific Islander community is very much in need. And I just also want to briefly mention that the Black community and the Pacific Islander community are the two communities in San Francisco that have the highest rates of adverse birth outcomes. But when you look across the state, you also see that Indigenous folks, Hmong people, certain groups of Latinx people, in particular Indigenous Latinx people, are also having these adverse birth outcomes. And in each case, it's very much rooted in histories of oppression and ongoing experiences of discrimination and oppression.
Thank you. I want to ask you a bit of a follow-up question. And so we talk about guaranteed basic income as a racial justice intervention or racial justice strategy, as an economic justice strategy, but can it also be considered a gender equity strategy? And can you talk a little bit about why or why not, what your thoughts are around that frame for guaranteed basic income, excuse me.
I guess I'm hesitant to call it a gender equity strategy, because what's happening to Black women is what I would call racialized sexism or sexualized racism, but there's an intersectional identity here. And I wouldn't want to erase the intersection, right? Like, this is something that is very specifically happening to people for who the most part identify as women and identify as Black. And so I see this as an anti-racist intervention to support a specific subset of Black identified, and in our case, Pacific Islander identified folks. And I think so often we think about, racism, and there's so many initiatives across California that are meant to address racism, but forming task forces and steering committees is a starting place, but it doesn't actually start to create change. And so, like, what I'm interested in is, what does it actually look like to dismantle racism in a city or in a state? And when we look at the Black community in California, what I know is that redlining and urban renewal have taken huge tolls on our communities and very much impeded our ability to build wealth and get an economic foothold. These historical incidents very much keep us in poverty, and that's not even to say anything about employment discrimination, hiring discrimination, and the high rates of Black unemployment that we see across the state because of frankly racially problematic behavior. And so, when people are concerned about racism, the question becomes, what do we do? And I don't want to suggest for a second that the Abundant Birth Project is the end-all be-all solution to racism, but what I do want to offer is that it is something tangible that is going to start to make repair for historical harms that continue to harm the Black community. So when you take something like urban renewal, like in San Francisco, that wiped out so much Black wealth in what was formerly a thriving Black community known as Harlem of the West, right? And I grew up in that community in the 80s, and I definitely did not experience any of that thriving attitude. And that was absolutely because of urban renewal. So what do we do about that? Well, at a minimum, we can try and protect the babies that are born into this community by giving the moms what they need to not be so stressed out that they can't have healthy pregnancies. And so that's one of the ways that I think of this as a way to start to address racism and dismantle historical racism, because we're starting to give something tangible that can offer a form of repair.
Just appreciate that response that you just provided, and it is reminiscent of what you lifted up when we spoke initially, that the Abundant Birth Project is an anti-racist intervention. And your initiative, this initiative, isn't just focused exclusively on poverty outcomes. It's also looking at health outcomes. What are you learning? What are you learning? What have you learned? And how are you able to continue to advance and to lift up this work?
So I guess my son is making an appearance. This is Miles
Hey,
Richardson.
if my daughter was here, she'd be making an appearance as well.
I mean, I think that one of the things that is so exciting to me about this project is that, we've been looking at health disparities in a pretty concerted way in the medical community since the 1980s, but we haven't been able to narrow the disparities hardly at all in the intervening years. And so I'm really excited about this idea of using cash as a health intervention. I think when you think about this in the social service world, you think a lot about like, wow, $1,000 a month, like that's a very expensive intervention. But when you come into the medical world, $1,000 a month, like that's super affordable. And so, what does it look like to actually use cash as a medical intervention? What does it look like to use a cash supplement to try and change a health outcome? And that's one of the things that I'm most excited about. What we have been learning is that we engaged 4 Black and Pacific Islander or Pacific Islander mamas from the community to become community researchers. And then we in turn interviewed a couple dozen other Black and PI mamas in the community so that we could really hear from them and understand what they need from this program, what hasn't worked in the past, and how we're most likely to be successful, because we understand that we need the folks who are going to be the beneficiaries of this community to be in the driver's seat. Otherwise, we're probably not going to be able to anticipate the barriers that they know very well, because this is the life that they live. They're the experts. So we learned from them that, pregnancy is extremely stressful, housing is extremely stressful. But what was also difficult is that a lot of them feel ashamed for receiving benefits because of the ways in which we've constructed the narratives, in particular around Black moms. There's so many narratives around this, Black moms being lazy, being welfare queens. So many politicians have operationalized that very harmful narrative to justify their reelection, but it comes at a cost. And so the work is not even just providing the cash, but also changing the narrative around Black birthing people and moms in general, so that people don't have to feel ashamed or guilty for trying to make repair for historical injustices that were absolutely not their fault. So those are some of the important learnings, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Malawa. I'm going to come back to you, and I appreciate you lifting up what has been a common theme around really erasing the caricature, changing the narrative. And so we'll come back to you, because I do have another question that I want to raise with you, but I want to bring in Mayor Asia Brown into this conversation. Mayor Brown, every time we've spoken privately, or every public event in which you are speaking, the consistent message, really since the time you were first running for elected office, has been centered around this bold vision for Compton. And that vision has been multifaceted, but the common denominator has been to leverage the richness of the city and to improve the quality of life for its residents. And so you recently launched the Compton Pledge, a guaranteed income pilot project in Compton that will distribute unconditional cash to 800 low-income residents over 2 years. And so let me just ask you first, what led you to launch a pilot, a guaranteed basic income pilot in your city, in the city of Compton?
Well, thank you, Alex, for the question, and thank you to Parker Blackman and to the entire team for having me. But when I heard, actually, I had watched my brother Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton roll out the Stockton Seed Program. And number one, I'm a policy student. I'm always studying what's happening in the nation and really internationally. And guaranteed income is not a new concept, but it was something that was really refreshed in a really avant-garde time to really have this discussion about equity and poverty in a new way. And my just passion is really about economic equity and justice. And so I recognize the power of a guaranteed income just from thinking and reflecting on my own life. And I was raised by a single mother, working poor. She decided to work and really at the economic disadvantage of herself because of the stigma of Black women on welfare. And she decided to earn less, pay more for childcare, not have supplemental assistance for my brother and I, just to not have that stigma. And so I recognized just the power of economic racism, equity, the structures and confines, and then the conversations and the stigmas around poverty. And so rolling into the pandemic, as Mayor Michael Tubbs, he'll always be a forever mayor. As he eloquently stated, mayors are just about action. And once they get on an issue, it's like you are like a bull. And so I knew that my residents needed immediate assistance. There were so many discussions and promises and hopes about the federal government stepping in and providing assistance to Americans. And it just didn't happen. And so I knew I had the fortunate ability to partner with Give Direct and provide some direct cash to residents immediately. But there still was a need for sustenance because we did not know when we were coming out of the pandemic. And so when Mayor Michael Tubbs reached out about the mayors for guaranteed income, and about being a founding member, I definitely hopped on board because I knew this was an actionable way to address the needs of my community. Also, from a policy standpoint, I recognize just how things work in America, and it takes many times mayors on the ground floor stepping out, doing the bold things that seem radical at the time, but that are really just actionable responses to what must be done. And so I recognize that we have an opportunity as mayors to really address the gap, the knowledge gap, the data gap, and also to be able to work on a broader policy on a national level, but then of course meet the immediate needs of our residents. And so those were some of the causal factors that really sprung me into action. And I saw this as a great opportunity to really address the formerly incarcerated individuals in my community, as well as the undocumented families in my community that were not eligible for any federal relief during this pandemic. And quite frankly, we're just in a ship without a sail. And so guaranteed income and starting this pilot in Compton was our response and our pledge to our Compton residents.
So Mayor Brown, how is the Compton Pledge going so far? I know that you have put out at least the first million has gone out to the ground. How is it going, and what have you learned so far as you go forward in this pilot?
Yes, well, it's going well. We have dispersed the first 1.2 million, as you said, Alex, and we will be dispersing $9.2 million throughout the 2 years. We currently have a fundraising gap of about $400,000 because we've signed up 800 families, but we're servicing 800 residents because our families have larger household sizes than we really anticipated. And so we're happy that we're addressing families that have children and that are in poverty and pulling them out, but at the same time, we're still working on concluding that gap. But what I learned was something that I knew innately, as Michael had shared, is that when given the opportunity, people will do the right thing for their families and they will be creative. I know for a fact that people that are fighting their way through poverty are naturally creative. They are resilient. They figure out how to make something out of nothing. They're going to make it happen. So I was just floored by the resilience and the responses that our residents shared. I had someone tell me that, you know what, they were finally able to pay down their tickets and apply for a job and get a job within a 3-month window. Many people don't understand that traffic infractions, moving violations can amount so quickly. One infraction can be $1,000 if not properly attended to, and $1,000 can be the difference between being a functioning part of society, a taxpayer in society, or just living in the margins. And so people were able to get out of the margins just by paying down traffic tickets. I learned that some families, a mother in particular, she forewent some just serious medical treatment that she needed because she couldn't afford the medication. And so she was actually able to pay for a medical procedure that she needed. And she is now, her hope is restored. She's feeling better. She's able to better care for her children. Her relationships are just stronger with her kids. She's been able to do more physically with them. And so the hope and the love in her family has just been elevated just by addressing poverty within her community. There was one woman who was formerly incarcerated. She came out, and obviously because she was formerly incarcerated, she is not able to qualify for many traditional jobs, but she was actually able to start her own motivational speaking business. And so now she has been booked for paid speaking engagements during the pandemic, motivating other formerly incarcerated women to be restored in their workforce and also how to build strong relationships with their families that they're returning to. So I've heard the gamut. The last thing I just want to share, because Compton is just, there always will be special to me, but I cannot tell you, we reached out to about 3,000 people, getting them signed up, just feeling their interest. And we had hundreds of people ask, how can we volunteer? How can we support this effort? We actually had 2 families decide that they would forego the guaranteed income, and they actually paid it forward to another family that was in greater need. And so those type of stories are, I mean, brought tears to my eyes. And that's just the type of love and resilience and the character of people that are in poverty that America sometimes will never see. So that's what's happening with the pledge.
That last story is just powerful and inspiring. Mayor Brown, you number of questions, but you've been doing this Compton Pledge without public dollars.
Yes.
And so a bit distinct from some of the others that have been lifted up. And so what role has philanthropy really played in helping to catalyze this effort? And how can philanthropy, you've already lifted up one example, but how else might philanthropy be able to participate in or help expand really what is an important effort taking place in the city of Compton?
First of all, philanthropy has been a tremendous difference maker in my tenure and my service in Compton. But I want to just give a special shout out to the Fund for Guaranteed Income. They were founded to really be a catalyst for bridging philanthropy and the wealthy to investing socially in evidence-based policy that makes sense. And so a big thank you to their partnership. But philanthropy has made the complete difference. We have not used any public dollars in the Compton Pledge to date. We have literally just partnered with philanthropists that wanted to do something during this critical time, that wanted to be a part of actionable solutions for people that are in poverty, and that were just, quite frankly, just tired of the same structure of just donating to organizations and having a small percentage go directly to the affected parties or the impacted. And so we've been able to really bridge the gap fully with philanthropy. Over the years, we've been able to do initiatives in the city of Compton with Compton natives, fully funded by philanthropy. So philanthropists, they have made a tremendous difference in the city of Compton as a whole, I can say significantly in the last 10 years, but especially with the Compton Pledge.
Thank you for that, Mayor Brown. I want to bring in a couple of the audience questions, but also ask the similar question to Dr. Malawa. You've received, in your program of Under Birth Project, has received some significant philanthropic contributions, but what role do you see philanthropy having on an ongoing basis as relates to either expanding or further catalyzing these efforts related to the work around expectant mothers, et cetera? So Dr. Malawa, give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that philanthropy for us, they served as early adopters. Like it was very hard to convince people early on that we should give Black low-income mothers unrestricted cash. I mean, now that we're having this conversation, this doesn't seem like a wild idea, but when we first started to bring this idea to life 3 years ago, like people really just thought I was nuts. And I am so grateful in particular to Hellman Foundation for being an early adopter and breathing life into our project, and for our other partners that came on afterwards. I'm also grateful because, you know, one of the things I think that we need philanthropy to do next is to start to investigate ways that we can do racially based cash payments through government funding. And we need somebody to pay for that legal research so that we can figure out what the long-term sustainability looks like. It's not that I don't want everyone to have cash, but I think that if there's not enough money for everyone to have cash, we need to recognize that there are certain groups that consistently have been at the bottom for funding, opportunities, et cetera, in this country, and we need to start to make the repairs. But in order to make the repair, we need to figure out the legal pathway forward, and it's not clear at this point. So I think that some of that legal work and political advocacy is another really important role for philanthropy. Lastly, I would say specifically with some projects like mine, we need big numbers in order to prove that we can make an impact on a health outcome. Some of these things where the outcome is not just generally to, you know, move people out of poverty, but to move people out of poverty and also achieve something like birth equity, we need big numbers in order to prove that that's possible. And so to try and scale a project like ours is going to absolutely rely on funders. And I don't think that we're unique in that regard. I just want to name briefly, even though she's not in California, that Dr. Aisha Nyandoro is running the Magnolia Mothers Trust for many years out of Jackson, Mississippi. And that's a really important inspiration for me. And that work, it deserves to live in other places. It deserves to grow. And so to scale some of these projects, in particular, some of these projects that are Black-led and are really making an impact in Black communities, like we need philanthropy to breathe ongoing life into those until policymakers are ready to take it up, and we have a clear legal pathway for policymakers to take it up.
Thank you so much for that. Before we bring in Supervisor Holly Mitchell, I want to pose a question to all of our panelists. It's a question that comes from our audience who raises the concern or the worry about guaranteed basic income's unintentional economic impacts, such as inflating local rent costs because owners know that people are receiving this guaranteed income. How do you protect against things like that? And I'll toss it to Michael first, and then Asia and Dr. Malawa to give a quick answer to that question, if possible.
Yeah, the quick answer is I can't cite the research. I'm not an economist, but there's all types of economics research. And we see that even playing out now in the conversation around sort of the American Rescue Plan, that the inflationary impacts of cash disbursements are much smaller than you would imagine. And I don't know the economic underpinnings behind that. I just know that's what several economists have shared in terms of when we're doing the pilot in Stockton, and also in this current conversation about sort of are we overheating the economy with these stimulus payments.
I just want to mention that, when the Trump tax cuts went through, we didn't have a long conversation about how that was going to impact low-income people. We make all kinds of economic choices in this country without really thinking about how it's going to impact low-income people, Black people, other people of color. And so, while maybe that is a consideration, I think that is a consideration when we are well on the pathway for, moving many people, in particular folks of color, out of poverty. Then we can maybe reflect on what some of the inflationary impacts might be. But in the meantime, there is an urgent and present need and a clear and obvious solution and a very deserving population. So to me, that needs to be the absolute focus.
Mayor Brown?
I'll just weigh in quickly that the participants within our pilots are completely confidential. We do not broadcast who are actually recipients of these funds. I do not know who these people are unless they contact me through other channels or other means, which is how I was able to get some of these direct stories through social media. But again, this is not something that would be shared publicly or broadly. And so their confidentiality would be concealed just like any other direct source of income received by the federal government or otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Still want to ask the audience to put in your questions, but at this time, we have the honor to be joined by Los Angeles County Supervisor Holly Mitchell. And Supervisor Mitchell, really needs no introduction, but let me just say a few brief words. She has been just a steadfast leader in the fight for justice, whether it's youth justice, whether it's racial justice or economic justice. She's been on the front lines throughout her career, well before she was a policymaker to end poverty, working to repeal the maximum family grant rule in CalWorks, are ensuring that the billions and billions of dollars in the state budget were a statement of our morals and our values that protected the social safety net and those most vulnerable. And just last week, Supervisor Mitchell led the Board of Supervisors in creating a countywide policy agenda to help end poverty, while also creating a guaranteed income pilot program in the county of Los Angeles. So much tremendous work that has been done. And so I want to ask the supervisor, first of all, welcome Supervisor Mitchell into this space and ask the question of why, it's a simple question, but a powerful question of why, and why is guaranteed income so important for LA County to establish, and why is this work overall so critical? And I want to pass it on to Supervisor Mitchell. I think that's our Chief of Staff right there. Ups.
Thank you, Alex. I'll introduce myself. I love to stand in her shadow. That's not a shadow I mind standing in, because that's good stuff right there. When you do good, you do well. And so Supervisor Holly Mitchell was running late. She's doing another taping. And so, but this is so important to her. She asked me to come on in case she misses her time slides. It's just too important for her to miss. So I am Frederica McGee. I'm the supervisor's chief of staff. And you're absolutely right. I just recently came to work for the supervisor a few months ago, but we have known each other almost 30 years. And so I've watched her work. She is probably one of the only elected officials I would come back to work with. I served in the California legislature as general counsel to 5 different speakers. So I've seen a litany of elected officials go through the process. And so it is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for pulling this gathering together, Alex. I so appreciate it. And hats off to Michael here and Mayor Brown. Good to see you all again. Nice to see you on virtually. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. But the why, we talk about the supervisor's history of poverty alleviation, and that is where her heart is. You talked about increasing the CalWorks grant and that work in that area. And when we did the motion last week, we were very thoughtful. Our team, we talked about not just the big picture. It wasn't that GI was the next shiny thing, which it seems to be. And I'm glad people are seeing that path forward. But the ultimate goal is poverty alleviation. That's the ultimate goal. And to allow and recognize, we've done some of these other steps in recognizing how racism plays an important part. Here she is. I was giving you an intro.
Everything she said, keep going.
Thank you.
You get it. You go. I was just starting to talk about why we framed it as poverty alleviation and guaranteed income being one of those paths to that ultimate goal.
Ms. McGee, thank you so much, and Supervisor Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us. Lifted up just your history well before you became a legislator, well before you became the chair of the budget committee, well before you became a supervisor in fighting poverty. Whether it was Western Center for Child Poverty, whether it was Crystal Stairs, just the work you have done. And so the question I wanted to ask you, and we'll bring in audience questions as well to the entire group of panelists, is really a question that I've heard you often ask so much. It's a simple question, but it's a powerful question, and it's the question of why. And so why is guaranteed income so important for LA County to establish, and why is this work overall so critical? And that's the question.
So Alex, thank you. And the why is reflected on your bookshelf right behind you, those 2 beautiful children that you've become the father of since I've known you. Mayor Tubbs and his beautiful baby with one on the way. The why is we are reversing a national trend where we've begun to criminalize poverty. You think about all of the war on drugs, policies that went into place that disproportionately impacted people living in poverty, and they were just exacerbated. Our why is we as government have to acknowledge the role we played in turning up the fire on the slow burn, in increasing the number of children living in poverty in California. When I think back to the Schwarzenegger years, when he proposed the complete wholesale elimination of CalWorks, when they reinstituted asset tests, when they cut the CalWorks cash grant by 8%, when they cut $1 billion out of subsidized childcare, when they eliminated Dental Cal, Those were all proactive actions taken by sitting policymakers in an effort to close a budget gap and a deficit. You know, here we are all these years later with a $76 billion reserve. Well, there were years when we were broker than broke, and they balanced those budgets on the backs of people who were already suffering. And so the why is very obvious. Poverty is the #1 driver of children in foster care. And LA County has 9,000 Black kids in foster care today. When we look at the disproportionate performance of kids in every system, be it our system of early education, K through 14, higher education, the kids who are in our juvenile justice system, our child protective services system, those are all children very likely who are victims of multi-generational poverty. And so what I would say when I was sat on the floor of the legislature, that I hadn't met a mother, regardless of her socioeconomic status, that didn't want the same thing for her children. And so we have come to a place where we've got to acknowledge it's about the resources. We know how far the vast majority of LA workers are from earning a livable wage in LA County. And so this is one way government can turn the tide on criminalizing poverty and acknowledge that people need cash, they need resources to be able to improve their lives and the lives of their children. And certainly in following Mayor Tubbs' example and the evaluation coming out of his pilot project to see how people spent their money. And I just have to tell you, it was so satisfying for me to hear those basic examples, given the years I fought in the legislature when my colleagues tried to do the diaper augmentation, and the legislators didn't want to give them cash. No, we'll give them certificates for the diapers, as if a mother who has a child who wears diapers is going to use those resources on something else. You know, the maximum family grant work we did, where for decades, people were penalized if they had another child while receiving cash aid, when the average family size of families on CalWORKs is no different than the average family size of anybody else. So again, it's really calling out the truth around people who have lived below poverty and giving them the resources they need to make the decisions that are in the best interest of their family and their children. And to, at the county level, to do a pilot to see if we can be a poverty disruptor in terms of early investments driven by decisions made by the family that are in their best interest. So I'm proud to join with the various mayors who were represented today. Now was the time. You know, Mayor Tubbs was the visionary, and we are all riding those coattails. When I think about my parents who met as eligibility workers, worked right here in LA County 60 plus years ago, it was a time such as this. After the Watts Rebellion, and Lyndon Johnson declared one of those, war on poverty, and federal dollars flooded South LA. What are we going to do with the investment this time to truly break that cycle, break the cycle of poverty, break the cycle, as you and I have worked on together, Alex, the cradle to prison pipeline? This is an opportunity to use government in such a way that we can be creative, we can partner with philanthropy, we can partner with other sectors to really meaningfully change the lives of working families who are just trying to make it every day in LA. That's why we are proud partners in the new guaranteed income movement.
Supervisor Bishop, you always speak truth to power, and just appreciate that. I want to bring in a couple of the questions, and Supervisor, I'll start with you and open it up to everyone on the panel, but a couple of questions from the audience. You talked about investing early and the tail end of that, so we don't have to invest on the back end. But what is the best way to promote or to lift up the issue of guaranteed income as a whole child investment is one of the questions that the audience has raised. So Supervisor, I will start with you for a quick response and then go to Mayor Brown and Dr. Malawa.
When I think back to the arguments we raised around maximum family grant, for those who may not be aware, 30 years ago, there was a Republican-led movement based on a failed hypothesis. The hypothesis was that poor women on CalWORKs had babies to simply extend their duration on CalWORKs and the amount of money they received. And the average increase in California, if you had an additional baby while on CalWORKs, was $111 a month. And so, you know, I said repeatedly for 5 years in the legislature, I don't know a woman, and she hasn't been born yet, that's going to have a baby for an extra $111 a month. And I think when we personalize it and we break away from the statistics and just stick to the brass facts about why extra resources are helpful for families, it resonates with people. I will never forget a Saturday when I was CEO of Crystal Stairs. I was at a child care provider and a parent training, and I'm a mom. And I came in and Ryan was maybe 8 or 9 and was playing t-ball. And I had to leave, you know, t-ball duty with my mom's baseball, softball jersey on and go to this conference. And so I was apologizing to the 500 or so women largely who were gathered there for my attire. And after I finished my comments, Alex, a woman came up to me with her son standing next to her, and I'll never forget the look in his eye. And she said, you know, I've never been able to afford to provide an opportunity for my boys to play t-ball or any kind of organized sports. And I don't even know how to go about signing them up. And I looked at him and I could see it in his eyes. And so if guaranteed income allows a mother to create an opportunity for her little boy to play organized sports, or her daughter to take swim lessons or gymnastics, or to have the kind of ordinary life experiences that we know enhances the lives of children, music lessons, whatever the case may be, that's what we must do. As we look at school performance and the disparity and the learning gaps between poor kids and kids of means, as we look at the language deficiency that children born into poverty enter preschool with, and how difficult it is and the kind of investment it takes to catch up. If guaranteed income allows that household to buy 3 or 4 more books, or allows that household to allow that mother or father to not have multiple part-time jobs, but to have one full-time job so they can read themselves to their children at night, those are the kind of smart investments that we know make a lifetime difference for the next generation. So I think in order to sell it and get people to get it, we have to find our own individual stories like that so people can apply it to their ordinary lives and really understand.
Thank you. Mayor Brown and Dr. Malawa, same question. You know, how do you lift this up? How do you amplify this just really critical work as a whole child investment?
I think the important aspect is to make sure when we are attempting to answer a problem that we properly really frame what we're talking about here. And people think guaranteed income, or it's been really erroneously branded that it's just giving people money, but it's not about giving people money. It's about addressing poverty with direct cash, which is really the deficit. If that's the presence of poverty, it's not only about the lack of funding, but it's the lack of opportunities that persistent poverty creates. Dr. Garcetti, who was a very renowned economist from Harvard, he created a platform, and really that was a result of a nationwide study called Opportunity Insights. And he proved the fact that what determines a person's ability to achieve and to break through the economic barriers of poverty is access to opportunities, whole neighborhoods. So as Supervisor Mitchell just talked about, there is a mother who couldn't sign her child up to access T-ball. Well, I'm a living example of that. I have a twin brother. We needed everything at the same time. And I forewent going into extracurricular activities so that my brother could, because I was more concerned about him being safe and not being introduced to gangs and other extra activities that could have really cost him his life. And so those are the types of stories that are really real, and it makes poverty, really illustrates what poverty really creates. It's not about someone being bad with money. It's that there is a system that was designed to create the environment and the economic disadvantages that exist today. I became an urban planner because I learned at USC that the ghettos were designed with policy. poor people just didn't decide to just come together and decide not to thrive. It was literally redlining, residential security maps, the continued and compounding impacts of not providing home loans at the same proportion as white people, as not providing economic opportunities, and it's pervasive in every indicator that matters. Home ownership today, small business attainment today, generational wealth today, just the opportunity to have healthy babies today, it still persists, and it was designed by the federal government. That's something that we have not atoned for as a nation. So guaranteed income is just, it's one small way to address the actual outcomes of the design poverty that was inflicted on Black people and people of color in this nation.
Dr. Malawa, we have 8 minutes, so I want to ask you another question from the audience before I transition to ask all of our panelists a final question. And the audience member asked and states they're curious to understand the relationship between poverty alleviation and birth early childhood outcomes. And is there early data coming out of the Abundant Births Project or other research that begins to demonstrate this correlation? You've talked to some of this in your previous remarks, but want you to answer that question if you can.
Yeah, I mean, the connection is stress. And people have different doses of stress depending on what their environment looks like. And one of the greatest stressors that we know about is racism. And another great stressor is poverty. And not to get too medically technical about this, but there's a phenomenon that is described as weathering, which is where the lifetime exposure to ongoing stress, and in particular racialized stress, has an impact on your ability to withstand disease. And it ages you quickly. So when we look at Black birthing people, what we find that their cells look like they are 30 years older than they should be. We find that their wombs are operating in a hormonal environment that is consistent with somebody who is experiencing acute stress of being in a war-torn area. And I don't think that's surprising to any of us who actually grew up Black, because we understand how impactful this stress can be. I think what is surprising is that we can so clearly define the medical toll that this stress takes. We lived this experience. Like, again, all of us who are Black have experienced people dying too early, people getting sick when they shouldn't. But in the society, until we can document it scientifically, it is not real. Well, we have documented it. And so this is the connection. And so the goal is that if we can reduce the stress that you're experiencing, and most often the stress of poverty is related to experiences of racism and racialized economic exclusion. If we can reduce that stress, then we can hopefully reduce some of those chemical cascades that are happening in your body that are causing you to not be able to have a healthy and safe pregnancy experience. Now, I just also want to name that is not going to have an impact on the racist doctor that you might face in the hospital, right? And so if we actually want to change birth outcomes for Black people, we need to have a multifactorial approach, of which cash is one critical piece, but not the only piece. But I hope that answers the audience member's question.
And we could have a whole conversation about that aspect as well.
Alice, can I add something real quick, please?
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm gonna keep butting in, and y'all not gonna invite me next time, and probably be justified. In listening to her, I was reminded, and Alex, you may have been in the room when the Center for the Study of Poverty it was either Stanford or UC Davis, I know they both have one, did a presentation once at the legislature, and I'll never forget these images, the images of the brain of infants and children, a child born in poverty and a child that wasn't. And it was the difference of looking at a black and white television show and a new high definition television show, just in terms of the synapses and the brain connectivity and the brain activity, and how at some point you never close that gap, you never catch up. And so as we talk about not only the health of the mother and our ability to deliver and bring healthy children into the world, but then when that child is born, if they are born into poverty and don't have those adequate resources, how literally brain development is directly impacted. Those images of those two side-by-side brain scans of two babies will never leave me because it was no fault of their mamas or theirs that they were in that circumstance. and we collectively have the power to change that. That's powerful.
Yeah, and I appreciate you raising that, Supervisor Mitchell. I was not in the room for that, but I remember at the time, as with Children's Defense Fund, my policy director bringing that up, and it was striking, and it continues to be striking, not just in this instance, but also in the youth justice work, and how the brain is just wired a particular way. So I appreciate you raising that. I want to make time for us to have a really short, we have 3 minutes left, opportunity to make some brief closing remarks. And I want to just bring in where we started, to close us out where we started. Mayor Tubbs lifted up the book, one of my favorite books by Dr. King, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos, Our Community. And so I want to pose that question to each of you. Short response, 30, 45 seconds or so. And I'll start with Mayor Brown. Where do we go from here?
We have the opportunity to craft a new horizon for our nation, and it starts with equity and justice for all, what we claim to stand for.
Thank you. Dr. Malawa.
I mean, I think that we start treating all of us as human beings, and we recognize that all of us want the same things. We want our kids to grow up healthy. We want them to have opportunities. We want to feel safe. We want opportunities. And so if we can start to connect to the humanity of Black people and other people of color, then I hope what will follow from that is that we can start to operationalize the golden rule in a policy way and treat others how you want to be treated.
Thank you so much. Mayor Tubbs.
Nothing really inspiring to say. I really think it literally depends on what we do after this conversation, right? Like we're the answer, so it's depend on what we do.
Thank you. And I'll give the final word to Supervisor Mitchell.
I appreciate that. I'm just so happy and proud to be where I am at this moment in time, partnering with these amazing local leaders to get this done. Veronica Lewis, Executive Director of HOPICS, a homeless services agency in the 2nd District, told me that the motivating quote she gave to her staff last year, her field team that were continuing to try to assist our unhoused in the middle of the pandemic, was, how big is your brave? So it's going to require that all of us decide that our brave has to be bigger than we imagine it individually, and come together collectively, every level of government, philanthropy, to solve a problem that is solvable, that we know what to do, and just exhibit the intestinal fortitude, as Dr. King would say, to step out there and do what's right on behalf of this generation and the next and the next and the next.
I want to thank each and every one of our panelists. I want to thank Mayor Garcetti, who kicked us off, Supervisor Holly Mitchell, Mayor Asia Brown, Dr. Zea Malawa, and Mayor Michael Tubbs for just your leadership. You are an inspiration. You are doing the work. You're not just talking the talk, you are walking the walk. And so gratitude on behalf of a grateful state, a grateful nation that is inspired by your leadership. And I'll pass it back to Parker to close us out.
Thanks, Alex. I don't really have the words to express my gratitude to our speakers today. That was in some ways overwhelming, honestly, how powerful that was. I'm deeply appreciative of the time, of the work, of your leadership. Alex, the same goes for you. Thank you for masterfully organizing this conversation and making the space for folks to share the incredible wisdom that they've shared. I really deeply appreciate your leadership as well. Thank you. And to all of you for joining us for the great questions. We've recorded this session. We will share the recording with all of you afterwards. There were some questions that were asked for that we couldn't get to, that we'll answer in writing. Folks asking for some of the incredible data and links to that, we'll share those as well. And we'll look forward to bringing you all back together for, I don't know how we're going to top this in October, but another conversation in October on a powerful topic. And in the meantime, I hope everyone takes care, stays safe, and continue the incredible work to alleviate poverty on behalf of not only LA County, but California's youngest and most vulnerable children and their families. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Take good care, and looking forward to continuing the work, as Michael said, and doing it every day from here forward. Take care, everyone. Thanks for being with us.